Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We have many more real stories that will give you chills. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our audience reaches. My name is Jonathan Kellum, though most folks who ever knew me well enough to call me anything simply said, Jonah. I'm 82 years old now, and time has worn me down to the point where I no longer feel afraid of being called a liar. Age has a way of smoothing out the useless things. Fear of judgment, fear of ridicule, fear of sounding insane. When your doctor tells you that your heart is working on borrowed time, and that each sunrise is a coin toss, you stop caring about what the world thinks. So, before I go, and I know I'm going, I want to tell you what happened in those mountains. I want to tell you the truth, or at least the truth as I lived it, as I felt it in my bones, as it remade the last decades of my life. But to understand the creature, to understand what came after, you have to understand me first. You have to know who I was before everything changed. I left the world in 1994, 2 months after the fire that took my daughter. I don't talk much about that night, not because I can't remember it, but because I can't forget. I was a paramedic back then, a good one, if I'm honest. I'd spent 20 years rushing into other people's burning homes, car wrecks, overdoses, heart attacks. I'd saved babies, talked dying men through their last breaths, and once held a woman's hand while she gave birth in the back of an ambulance. And then one night, my own house caught fire while I was at the station. A power line collapsed from a windstorm. The attic ignited first. My little girl, Emily, was upstairs. By the time I reached my street, the sky above my house was glowing orange. Neighbors were screaming. Firefighters were shouting. But all I could hear was my daughter's voice in my head shouting, Dad! Even though I know now she never had the chance. Everyone told me it wasn't my fault. Everyone. But grief is strange. It doesn't need permission to destroy you. It doesn't need your logic, or your friends, or your pastor telling you God has a plan. It just crawls into your chest and hollows you out from the inside. 4 weeks after the funeral, I sold the last place that had ever felt like home. I didn't want to see the rebuilt walls, the new roof, the flowers neighbors planted near the sidewalk. I didn't want the pity in their eyes. So I loaded what little was left of my life into a rusted '78 Ford and drove into the mountains. I bought an old hunting cabin in Gray Hollow, Washington, 60 acres of thick forest, steep ravines, and silence so heavy it felt like a living thing. The cabin was barely standing. The porch sagged like a drunk leaning over a bar. The wooden roof was warped and peeling. Inside, the place was cold enough to see my breath even in spring. But the isolation was exactly what I wanted. I didn't want neighbors. I didn't want a town. I didn't want anyone to ask how I was doing. I wanted to disappear. And in that place, it felt like I had. For the first 3 months, my life blended into a routine of quiet survival. Chopping wood, clearing brush, patching leaks, boiling creek water. I kept my old paramedic radio mostly off because the sound of human voices made my chest ache. Nights were the worst. Too much silence, too much room for the mind to wander into places it shouldn't. I would lie awake, listening to the forest shift and breathe, convincing myself that the loneliness was better than the guilt. Then came the night I heard the first sound. It was mid-September, still warm enough for the windows to stay cracked open. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a low, heavy thud-like, a tree limb hitting the ground, but slower, more deliberate. Then another. Then the unmistakable sound of something large walking through the brush near the tree line. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I'd been around bears before, and this didn't sound like a bear. Bears shuffle, grunt, huff. Whatever this was moved with a kind of weight that carried intention. I grabbed my flashlight and my old .30-06 rifle, not because I wanted to shoot anything, but because fear makes the hands reach for familiar things. When I stepped outside, the night felt strangely dense. The moon was thin and pale, barely lighting the clearing. The forest stood like a black wall around the cabin, and the shadows between the trees looked deeper than usual, as if they were holding their breath. And then I saw them. Tracks, not bear, not elk, not anything I had ever seen. They were longer than my boot by half and deep. The weight required to make them must have been enormous. The stride was wide, too wide for a human. The shape. Well, I told myself not to think about that. Memories of tabloid drawings and campfire stories tried to crawl into my head. I pushed them out. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my chair with the rifle across my lap and the lamp burning low, listening to the forest. But nothing else came. Eventually dawn broke, and with the daylight came the peculiar courage that shamefully disappears at night. I told myself I had exaggerated the size of the prints. The mind plays tricks in the dark. I shrugged it off. 2 days later, I stopped shrugging. I went down to the creek that morning with 2 buckets to haul water back to the cabin. As I stepped around a thicket of ferns, I saw something lying on the bank. At first, I truly believed it was a dead bear. The fur looked dark, matted. The body was massive. The angle of the limbs was strange. But as I moved closer, slowly, each step slower than the last, I realized the proportions were all wrong. The torso was broader. The arms were longer. The legs were shaped differently. And then it moved. A low groan, deep enough to vibrate the leaves around me, rolled through the air. The creature shifted slightly, its chest heaving. I froze, every muscle locked in a fear I hadn't felt since pulling a dying man out of a crushed pickup years ago. My hands trembled. My mouth went dry. Then the creature opened its eyes. Amber. Deep, intelligent amber. Not the wild panic of a wounded animal, but a deliberate, conscious focus. It looked at me. Not through me. Not past me. But at me. Like it was trying to decide whether I was threat or mercy. Its chest. God, its chest was crushed in a way no man could survive. Something had slammed into it with tremendous force. The breath rattled out of its lungs like stones scraping together. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to do just that. But old habits die hard. And the paramedic in me, the one I'd been trying to bury for years, came alive. Before I could think, I dropped the buckets and knelt beside the creature. My voice shook as I whispered, "Easy. Just easy now." I didn't expect it to understand, but something in its eyes softened, ever so slightly. When I touched its fur, it flinched. Not from anger, but pain. The hair was coarse, thicker than anything I've ever felt. Underneath it, the skin was warm, firm, very much alive. I don't know how long I worked on it. Time warped. I checked its breathing, examined its wounds, did what I could to ease the pressure on the crushed ribs. There was blood thick, dark, almost tar-like, but not pouring. Slow, sluggish oozing. Internal damage was the real killer. "I can't fix you," I said quietly. "But I won't leave you." Maybe it understood. Maybe it didn't. But when I stepped back to breathe, the creature slowly, painfully rolled onto its side. It pushed itself upright, towering even in its weakened state. Then, in a moment that will haunt me for the rest of my life, it touched the ground near my boot. A gesture. Simple. Deliberate. A thank you. It limped into the forest, using the trees to steady itself, and within seconds, the shadow swallowed it whole. I stood alone beside the creek, the buckets forgotten, my hands trembling, my heart racing. My world, the world I had tried so hard to shrink down to nothing but wood smoke and creek water, had cracked open. Something impossible had just looked into my eyes and chosen not to kill me. Something enormous, wounded, intelligent. And something else happened the next morning that made me realize this wasn't over. When I opened my cabin door at sunrise, there was a single object on the porch, a long metal spike-thick, barbed, sharp, like a piece of industrial hunting equipment. Someone had shot that creature. Someone who knew what they were hunting. Someone who was still somewhere in those woods. And they had been close enough to leave a message. I didn't sleep the night after finding that metal spike on my porch. It lay there like a warning, like a reminder that something in those woods was being hunted, and that whoever was hunting it might happily go through me to finish the job. But the strange thing was this. The spike wasn't thrown carelessly. It had been placed, set deliberately in the center of the porch boards, as if the creature wanted to show me what had hurt it, as if it wanted me to understand. It rained that morning. Cold autumn rain that fell in sheets so thick it turned the clearing into a blur of silver. I sat inside by the window with the spike on the table, staring at it between sips of bitter instant coffee. It was heavy, thicker than the spikes hunters use for traps. The barbs were filed in a way that didn't look like factory work. Handmade, hard, unmistakably human. Every instinct told me to pack up, leave, run back to society, surrender my solitude for safety. But I had spent so long running from memories that the idea of fleeing again felt like returning to a life I no longer knew how to live. And something else held me there, something I didn't yet understand. Something in the creature's eyes when it let me help it. 4 days passed without incident. No tracks, no noises, no signs. I started to convince myself that the creature, whatever it was, had gone deeper into the mountains. Maybe it had died. Maybe the hunters had found it. I tried to believe that. I told myself that if it stayed gone, I could return to my quiet isolation. But on the 5th morning, just as dawn bled through the trees, I heard a familiar weight shifting in the brush. Not the stumbling steps of a wounded animal, not the clumsy crashing of elk, but a slow, deliberate movement, like something trying to approach without frightening me. I opened the door, and there it stood. Not as close as the porch, but near the tree line, its broad frame half veiled by mossy branches. Even at that distance, I could see it was still hurt. Its posture slouched, its breathing shallow, but its eyes, those amber eyes, were fixed on me, steady and alert. I stepped outside slowly, palms open, the universal gesture of, I mean no harm. The creature watched, head tilted slightly, as if analyzing each motion. Then, with a cautiousness that didn't seem natural for something so massive, it stepped forward. Its hand, if you could call something that large a hand, unfolded from its side, and resting in its palm was a stone, a smooth, river-shaped stone, pale gray, perfectly oval. But what struck me wasn't the stone itself, it was the mark carved into it. A spiral with 3 branching lines, etched roughly but intentionally. No tool marks, no metal scrape, just grooves made by something powerful and controlled. The creature lifted the stone, holding it out. A gift, or a sign, or maybe just acknowledgement. My throat tightened. I don't know why. Maybe because it had been years since anyone gave me anything without wanting something in return. I took the stone with a slow, shaking hand. "Thank you," I whispered. The creature emitted a low, steady sound, not a growl, but something closer to a deep hum reverberating through the air like distant thunder. Not threatening, not fearful. Almost approving. That morning lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then the creature turned, stepped back into the forest, and vanished between the ferns. But something fundamental had shifted between us, and inside me. It returned the next morning, and the next, always keeping distance, always watching. Sometimes it stayed only a few breaths. Other times it lingered long enough to sit near the edge of the clearing. It never crossed fully into the open, but it didn't hide either. It simply existed close enough that I could feel its presence like a pressure in the air. At first, I didn't speak. I didn't know what to say. But solitude had stripped me of my pride, and one day, as I chopped firewood, I caught myself talking out loud. Talking to it. About random things. About the weather. About the creek running low. About how the nights felt colder than they used to. It didn't respond. But it listened. I could tell by the way its head angled toward me, the way its chest rose a little deeper when I spoke. It was 2 weeks into this pattern when the first real moment of trust happened. I was patching the roof in ongoing battle against time and weather, when my hammer slipped and clattered off the shingles. I cursed under my breath and scooted forward to grab it. Except the hammer wasn't there. It had landed at the edge of the roof, and now a large, shaggy hand was holding it. I froze. The creature was standing right below me, closer than it had ever dared to come. It looked up at me, not with aggression, but curiosity, a kind of calm interest that made the hair on my neck rise. It lifted the hammer slightly, offering it back. I climbed down slowly, boots scraping the ladder, heart pounding. When my feet finally hit the ground, the creature extended its arm even more, bridging the remaining distance. I reached out and took the hammer. Our hands didn't touch, not yet, but the gap between them felt charged. "Thank you," I said again. The creature made a soft exhale, not quite a sound, more like an acknowledgement. Later that same day, as I worked on replacing a warped board on the porch, the creature sat nearby at the forest edge, watching, always watching. I'd begun calling it Ashen in my head, not out of whimsy, but because the silver in its dark fur glimmered like ash in firelight. When a knot in the board made my work harder, frustration got the better of me. I muttered angrily and pried the wood too hard, splitting it unevenly. I threw the dull chisel onto the porch floor. Ashen stood. My breath caught, but instead of retreating, it approached. Slowly, carefully. It picked up the split board and examined it. Then it lifted another board, the one I had cut cleanly earlier, and held them side by side. I thought it was comparing the quality, judging me even. But then it gently placed both pieces next to each other and stepped back. No rejection, no frustration, just acceptance. The flawed board and the perfect one were treated the same. Both had value. Both served purpose. A lesson. One I hadn't expected from something so wild. I sat down on the porch stairs, rubbing my hands over my face. I hadn't realized how much anger I carried toward myself, toward the world, toward the fire that stole my daughter. And somehow, this creature, this impossible being standing in front of me, had seen the storm inside me, and responded, not with fear, but understanding. "Are you trying to teach me something?" I asked aloud. Ashen lifted its gaze, then touched its broad chest lightly with 2 fingers, and made a short, low sound, almost like a note of reassurance. We were building something, not a friendship. Not yet. But a fragile, cautious understanding, which made what happened next even harder. It started on a cold night in late October. I woke to distant howling wolves moving through the hollow. Not unusual. But this night, their voices had a frantic edge. A hunt. I walked to the window and froze. There was movement near the creek. Large, struggling movement. Shadows thrashing against moonlight. I grabbed my flashlight and stumbled barefoot into the cold. What I found stopped me in my tracks. Ashen was crouched near the water, surrounded by several wolves. The wolves never attacked humans unless provoked, but this wasn't a human. And they were desperate, thin from the early frost and hunger. They circled, darting in, trying to test the creature's limbs. Ashen swung one arm to keep them back, but it moved with visible pain, still not recovered from the earlier injury. "Hey!" I yelled before I could think. My voice cracked the air. The wolves paused. Their yellow eyes flashed toward me. Then, with a few quick steps, they retreated into the darkness, disappearing as quickly as they had come. Ashen collapsed onto one knee. I rushed to it. When I reached its side, I realized it wasn't heavily wounded by the wolves, just exhausted, weakened, scraped from struggling. Its breathing was rough, labored. "I've got you," I murmured, my hands finding its arm by instinct. "You're all right. You're all right." Ashen didn't resist. It let me guide it a few feet from the creek. It lowered itself onto the ground, not fully lying down but leaning heavily against a stump. Its chest rose and fell like each breath was a battle. For the first time, its hand found mine. Massive, warm, heavy, but gentle. So unbelievably gentle. I didn't move, neither did it. And in that quiet moment, under the moon and the whispering pines, something unspoken passed between us, an understanding, a fragile thread binding two lonely beings who had both lost too much. Trust. Real trust. Morning found us still sitting there, though Ashen had regained enough strength to stand and return to the woods. But not before it paused, looked back at me, and touched its chest again with that small, deliberate motion. Acknowledgement. Acceptance. Maybe even something like gratitude. What I didn't yet know was that trouble was coming, and it wasn't the wolves I needed to fear. It was the men who had put that spike in its chest. Men who knew Ashen existed. Men who knew exactly where to hunt. Men who were already coming closer. I sometimes think back to the exact morning I realized the danger wasn't wolves, hunger, or the cold. It was men. Not in an abstract way. Not the philosophical sense in which mankind destroys forests and pollutes rivers, but in the literal sense. Flesh and blood men with rifles, engines, and the kind of dead stare that tells you they'd shoot first and ask nothing later. Men who see the world not as something alive, but as something to conquer. I was splitting cedar near the cabin when I heard the sound, an engine grinding its way up the steep ridge road. I hadn't heard another vehicle in close to 6 months. The nearest neighbor lived 12 miles west. Anyone stupid enough to come this deep into Gray Hollow wasn't just passing through. I set my axe down, wiped my hands on my jeans, and walked to the porch. A mud-coated pickup emerged from the trees, its grill plastered with dried clay and pine needles. 3 men stepped out, big, broad-shouldered, hard-jawed. Brothers, judging by the similar features. I recognized the eldest immediately. Hank Haymark, local troublemaker, known for trapping illegally, drinking heavily, and picking fights at the tavern in Stonelight Ridge. I'd patched up one of his victims back when I was still a paramedic. The Haymark brothers walked toward me with that slow, heavy confidence of men who believe the land belongs to them. "Morning," Hank said, though nothing in his voice sounded like mourning or courtesy. I nodded once. "Something I can help you with?" He spat to the side. "We're tracking something. Big. Dangerous." My stomach tightened. Ashen. "What kind of something?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Something that ain't supposed to be here," said the middle brother, Russ. "Something that tore up one of our traps, bent the metal clean." They looked at me with eyes that searched for cracks in my expression, for any hint of fear or recognition. I kept my face still. Haven't seen anything unusual. The youngest, Fletcher, walked to the side of my cabin, checking footprints near the tree line. Tracks go right past here, he said. I forced myself not to look at the exact spot where Ashen had been standing the morning before. Plenty of wildlife come through. Bears, cougars. Hank cut me off. These ain't bear tracks. He stepped closer, invading my space enough that I could smell stale beer on his breath. If you see something strange, you tell us. I didn't answer. Not because I was brave, but because I knew my voice wouldn't come out steady. Hank smiled in a way that wasn't a smile at all. We know where to find you. Road's rough, but we don't mind the trip. The brothers climbed back into their truck, slammed the doors, and drove off. The engine roared through the pines, echoing long after the truck was gone. I stood there until the sound vanished completely. Only then did I realize my hands were shaking. Ashen didn't come back for 2 days. I told myself that maybe he had sensed danger. Maybe the scent of the truck scared him off. But part of me feared the worst, that the haymarks had found him. On the third evening, just as the sun dipped behind the ridge, I felt that familiar heaviness in the air, the same presence I'd grown used to sensing before he appeared. I turned, and there he was, standing only 10 yards away. But something was wrong. He was tense, upright, alert in a way I hadn't seen since the wolves. His eyes flicked toward the direction of the ridge road, and then toward me. A warning. You saw them, I whispered. Ashen lowered his head slightly, confirming without gestures. Slowly, he motioned with his arm, an urging movement, telling me to leave, to go inside, to hide. Me. He was telling me to hide. I'm not going anywhere, I said quietly. Not without knowing you're safe. He looked at me for a long moment, then lifted his hand in a sweeping gesture toward the woods. I had seen him make similar gestures before, but never with this urgency. He wanted me to follow. Not for ritual, not for learning, for something else. I grabbed my jacket and flashlight and stepped into the forest behind him. We moved deeper into Gray Hollow than I had ever gone. The trees grew older here, their trunks so wide that 3 grown men couldn't wrap their arms around them. The air was colder, stiller. Even the birds stayed quiet. Ashen led me down an incline, over a fallen cedar, through a narrow cut between 2 boulders. And then the forest opened into a clearing I hadn't known existed. At the far edge stood a stone wall, not a man-made wall, not a ruin. Something natural, but not natural at the same time. A formation of stacked granite slabs, arranged in precise lines and angles that no landslide could create. Moss draped over the stones like old velvet. Ferns grew between the crevices. But what struck me most were the carvings. Dozens of spirals, lines, symbols. The same shape as the stone Ashen had given me, but multiplied 100-fold. Worn down by wind and time, but still unmistakable. Ashen stepped forward and touched one of the symbols. His hand lingered on it as if on a gravestone. My breath caught. "This is your home," I said softly. He turned to me, and the sorrow in his eyes was something I didn't expect from a creature so strong, so ancient-looking. A sorrow that wasn't just personal, it was collective. "How long have your kind been here?" I whispered. He didn't answer in any way I understood, but he didn't need to. In that clearing, surrounded by symbols older than the cabins, older than towns, older perhaps than any human footprint in this valley, I understood. Ashen wasn't an intruder. I was. We stayed there for a long time. I wanted to ask questions, but words felt too small. When Ashen finally motioned for us to leave, I followed without speaking. He led me back partway toward my cabin, before halting abruptly. He lifted his head, listening. Then I heard it too. Engines. Multiple. Coming fast. The Haymark brothers. Ashen gestured frantically for me to go, to run, to live. But running is something I'd done enough in my life. Running had cost me my daughter. Running had left me alone in these woods. I wasn't going to run now, not from this. "I'm not leaving you," I said, voice shaking. "I won't." He stared at me, chest rising and falling in slow, pained rhythm. Then he did something unexpected. He reached out and placed a hand massive, warm, heavy on my shoulder. A gesture that said everything he couldn't. A goodbye. A thank you. A warning. Then he stepped back into the trees, vanishing into shadows just as the first truck entered my clearing. The Haymarks arrived armed, rifles slung over their shoulders, knives at their belts. Fletcher was bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow. Something had already happened. Hank banged his fist on my porch door. "Open up!" I did. Their eyes swept the cabin interior. Russ stepped inside without permission, checking corners, under the bed, behind the stove. "Where is it?" he demanded. "I don't know what you're talking about." Hank's lip curled. "We found fresh prints, big ones, followed them up here." Fletcher picked up a piece of wood from my porch. "Claw marks," he muttered. "Deep ones." Russ turned to me. "You're helping it." "I'm not helping anyone." That was when Hank stepped close, so close I could feel the heat of his breath. "We know what we saw," he hissed, "and we're gonna finish this hunt. You get in the way, old man. You'll end up missing." I swallowed. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he smirked. "Neither do you." They shoved past me, heading toward the back of the cabin. Panic hit me like a fist. Ashen. They were searching, tracking, closing in. I stayed between them and the hidden trapdoor that led to the old storm cellar beneath my cabin floor. I'd reinforced the hatch years ago, but I knew it wouldn't hold if they found it. They tore through my belongings, overturned chairs, ripped open crates. With each passing second, the certainty grew inside me. If they found that cellar, they'd kill him. If they suspected I had protected him, they might kill me too. And then Fletcher shouted, "Down here!" My heart stopped. He had found the trapdoor. Hank yanked it open, rifle raised. Ashen exploded upward, not violently, not with killing intent, but in survival instinct. His enormous frame burst from the shadows, knocking Fletcher aside and forcing Hank backward. The brothers shouted, stumbling, firing shots that missed in the chaos. Ashen didn't fight. He fled, crashing through the far wall of my cabin and disappearing into the forest, faster than anything his size should be able to move. When the brothers recovered, they ran after him, leaving splintered boards and muddy footprints behind. I stood alone in the quiet destruction of my home, my breath ragged, my hands trembling. Something inside me shattered that night, not just fear for what was coming, but the realization. Ashen was wounded. He was alone. And the Haymarks would not stop. They would hunt him until he couldn't run anymore. And I knew with absolute certainty that if I didn't go after him, if I didn't find him first, I would lose him forever. I didn't sleep the night the Haymarks tore through my cabin. I barely even breathed. Long after their shouts faded into the forest and their truck engines growled into the distance, I stood amid the splintered wood and overturned furniture, staring at the hole in the wall where Ashen had escaped. My hands shook so badly I had to press them against the table to keep them still. The cabin had never looked small to me until that moment. Suddenly, it felt like a fragile shell, one hard kick away from collapsing entirely. And maybe that's what it was. A shell. A last refuge I'd built around the ruins of my life. But Ashen had become part of that refuge, and now he was out there, alone, wounded, hunted. There's a strange thing that happens when you've already lost the most important person in your life. Everything else becomes crystal clear. the fear that paralyzes most men becomes something quiet, manageable. And love, not the romantic kind, but the kind born of loyalty, of shared sorrow, becomes a fire hot enough to burn through hesitation. I grabbed my coat, my flashlight, a small pack of supplies, and stepped into the cold, pre-dawn forest. I was going after him. The trail was easy to follow at first, not because he was careless, but because he was hurt. Branches were bent at angles that spoke of enormous weight pressing through them. Moss along fallen logs was disturbed in long, dragging streaks. Pine needles lay crushed in patterns that matched a gait I had come to recognize. The long stride, the uneven pause, the slight favoring of one side. But the worst sign was the one I tried not to acknowledge. Dark patches along the ground, soaking into leaves and tying knots in my chest. Ashen was losing strength. I whispered into the trees, "Hold on. Please, just hold on." I don't know who I expected to hear me. Maybe God. Maybe the forest. Maybe Ashen himself. But the woods remained silent except for the distant echoes of ravens calling to one another as daylight slowly clawed its way past the mountains. Hours passed. I walked until my knees trembled and my breath came in shaky bursts. My age caught up with me. I was not the man who once ran through burning houses and carried injured strangers out of wreckage. I was someone older, slower, more breakable. But grief and purpose pushed me forward. The forest shifted as I entered deeper territory, an older part of Gray Hollow, untouched by logging, untouched even by most wildlife. The air smelled different here, sharper, colder, as though I'd stepped into a place the world had forgotten. Then, suddenly, the trail vanished. No more bent branches, no more prints, no more signs. For a terrible moment, I feared he had collapsed somewhere nearby where I couldn't see him. But then I noticed something faint, a groove in the earth, long and subtle, like something heavy had been dragged. I followed it. It led me down a slope into a hollow I had never known existed, a place where the ground was blanketed in thick moss and ancient roots, curled like old hands. And there, beneath a massive cedar that must have been older than the founding of the state itself, I found him. Ashen. He was sitting, back against the trunk, his legs stretched in front of him. His chest rose and fell slowly, each breath deep and deliberate, as though taken through willpower alone. His fur, usually so dark and gleaming, looked dulled by exhaustion. But his eyes, those amber eyes, lifted to me the moment I stepped into the hollow. "Hey," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I'm here." He didn't move at first. He only watched me, and in that gaze was something I had seen in very few creatures, an understanding older than language, a knowing acceptance of what was coming. I knelt beside him. Up close, he looked smaller. Not physically, he was still enormous, but in the way someone does when life begins to loosen its hold. His breathing was shallow now. His arms rested at his sides, palms open against the moss. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice trembling. "I should have protected you better." He blinked slowly, then lifted one hand with visible effort and placed it gently over mine. Warm, heavy, familiar. I held that hand with both of mine. "I'm not leaving," I whispered. "Not again." He reached to his side and gripped something another stone, oval, smooth. But this one had a carving unlike the first, a simple outline of two figures standing side by side, crude but unmistakable. One tall, one small. Together, a final message. He placed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it with a tenderness I will never forget. Tears blurred my vision. I didn't realize I was crying until the drops hit the stone. Ashen looked at me once more. Really looked, like he was memorizing my face the way someone memorizes the shape of a home they know they'll never see again. His chest rose, fell, rose again, slower. Then, with a breath that trembled like wind through old branches, he closed his eyes. And his body relaxed, settling into the moss as though becoming part of the forest itself. I don't know how long I stayed there. An hour, maybe more, maybe less. Time doesn't behave normally when something breaks in you. It stretches and contracts and coils around moments like vines around stone. When the shadows began to lengthen, I knew what I had to do. I found a stick and cleared away enough moss and leaves to dig. The earth beneath the cedar was soft, rich, forgiving. I dug with my hands when I had to. I didn't stop, even when my fingers went numb. When the grave was deep enough, I placed him inside. I covered him slowly, layer by layer, whispering apologies, memories, and thanks. When I finished, I set the carved stone atop the mound. A marker, a promise, a final witness. Night fell fully by the time I stood up. The forest around me felt different, emptier, quieter, like an entire presence had vanished from it. As I began the long walk back to my broken cabin, I realized something. The danger was not gone. The haymarks would come back, except they never did. A week later, while hiking to gather supplies, I found their abandoned truck half buried in bramble near the riverbank. The doors hung open. Inside, rifles, empty beer cans, and personal belongings. But no men. To this day, nobody in town knows what happened to them. They simply vanished into the mountains, swallowed by the same wilderness they tried to dominate. I don't pretend to know who or what took them. All I know is that the forest protects its own. I am an old man now. The cabin is gone, overtaken by creeping ivy and time. I live in a small room with a single window that faces west, and every evening the sunset hits that window in a way that reminds me of Gray Hollow. The faded gold, the stillness, the aching beauty of solitude. Sometimes, when sleep refuses to come, I open the drawer beside my bed. Inside is the stone Ashen gave me that last day. 2 figures, side by side, together. My fingers trace the carving until they remember the weight of his hand on mine. I tell this story not to prove anything, not to convince the world that creatures like him exist. Most people wouldn't believe me even if they saw my memories like film reels. I tell it because I owe him that much. Because he was the last living thing that made me feel less alone. Because he showed me that connection, real connection, is possible even for the broken. And because in the end, the story of Ashen isn't about monsters. It's about what still lives in the dark corners of the wilderness, waiting for us to remember how to see. And maybe, when my time comes, when I take my last breath, I hope he'll be there. Just a shadow at the doorway, tall, quiet, and waiting, the way he did all those years ago.